Welcome to the Productive Introvert Community Podcast, helping ambitious introverts who feel deep down that they can add more value to the world to really thrive in their work. I'm Mariela Franker, and I'll be sharing what I'm learning as an introverted entrepreneur, a natural productivity coach, and a mom while I build my business online and take care of my family and myself. In this podcast, you'll learn the mindset and the practical steps to naturally increase the impact of your work while making space for your unique strengths as an introvert. In today's episode, I'm taking you a little bit behind the scenes and talking about the lessons that I learned when building this podcast. So I love a good case example. I think personally I learned the most from other people's examples and the way that they've approached things. And then what can I take from that to use in my own strategies or my own working process? So that's the reason why I thought I wanted to share this with you. The interesting thing was that preparing for this podcast did not go according to plan, not really. Because the things that I thought were going to be an issue were not. And the things that I didn't even think about were things that came up and that were challenging and that I had to navigate when they presented themselves. So for example, when I started, I was really worried about the tech. I thought that the tech was going to be the hardest thing, how the podcast kind of hangs together and, how to actually get it published on the different podcast apps. But once I had figured out what platform I was going to use, and I use Anchor, I had that figured out pretty quickly. There's so many helpful tutorials online that pointed me in the right direction, and they make it really easy for you. Once I decided that I was going to use Anchor, everything was there for me to publish it to the different channels. You just basically click on the link to publish to Apple Podcasts, and then it sends you straight to the place where you can upload your first episode. So that part was I was super nervous about it, and it turned out to be super simple. The most difficult thing was making time in my schedule, because especially when you run your business, and I don't know if you recognize this, but anything new that you do comes on top of your existing workload. This isn't just for people who have their own business. If you have a busy job, it's the same, right? Anything extra that you want to do, you want to develop, your personal development, it comes on top. And this can be even more challenging when we work in a team or work with clients, because we tend to put other people's requests ahead of our own. So one of the ways that I navigate this is by spending at least 10 minutes at the start of my work day to think about what I would really like to get out of that day. And I factor everything in, business related, sometimes also related to my private life. And it's a way for me to prioritize my own wishes. It's a way to prioritize your own goals and dreams, and to make them a priority, give them a place of honor in your day. I also heard someone else mention that the way she does this, and I think this is really powerful, is she actually treats herself as a new client that she's acquired. And by doing that, she makes sure that she gets the same level of attention that she would give to her clients. In a way, this podcast was one of the projects that I was doing. It wasn't just something I was playing around with. It became my main project for those 6 weeks. But the day-to-day of it got a bit complicated at some point because the project just grew. When you're a creative person, you have all these ideas. Sometimes it happens that you bite off a little bit more than you can chew. So I prepared very well for the podcast itself. I've mentioned before that I was thinking about it for well over a year, probably. It wasn't super intentional at the time, but I was thinking about it, exploring different options and, learning from other people listening to other podcasts. So in that sense, I prepared quite well for the podcast itself. But then, let's say a month before I was gonna start, I decided, oh, you know what I can do? I'm gonna share my process. I'm gonna do a share my process series about everything that's going on with the podcast. And I thought, oh my God, that's a brilliant idea. And I'm so doing that. And I got super excited. And that's what I did. But what I didn't realize is that the share my process was as much work as a podcast itself. And I did not prepare very well for that part. It's not because it seems like it's less important in our minds. That doesn't mean that it takes less time or less effort. So this is one of the reasons why I always say focus on the most important thing for that day. I am a real minimal effort, maximum effect kind of person. And I kind of overestimated myself leading up to this podcast. So what happened in the end is that I spent most of the time, I think maybe 4, even 5 weeks of that 6-week block of time that I set aside to bring this podcast out. More than half of that time was spent on the pre-podcast series and kind of figuring out all the stuff around that. And then it wasn't until the last week or two that I started working on the real podcast episodes. See how I use that word real, like the other stuff wasn't real? It's interesting how we do that, isn't it? I'll unpack that another time. So I was scrambling a little bit towards the end to get things done, especially because of the editing. It was something I hadn't done before, and I was also super worried about that. And it's not perfect. I almost redid the entire welcome episode because I didn't like the way the music was fading in and out. But I had to kind of stop myself because if I'm perfectly honest, that's a great example of something that would still be a lot of effort, but might not have the biggest impact on my overall goal. So I decided to let it go for now. So the plan kind of changed. My initial plan was to have 10 episodes pre-recorded. Now I giggle because it's maybe it was a little ambitious, but not impossible, you know. So that's what I set out to do. 10 podcast episodes pre-recorded. I thought it would be great. I'll just think it all through before I start. I'll just take one whole day, okay, maybe 2, and record all of them. And then I can just release them a week at a time, and I'll have 10 weeks, like 2 whole months that I can just completely focus on other things, and this would just be working by itself. Great idea in theory. Turns out, well, honestly, I did do something like that in a fashion because I released 8 pre-podcast episodes plus the welcome episode in those 6 weeks. And that's 9 episodes in total. So near the 10 podcast episodes that I intended, but they were not the actual episodes that I intended, and they were not pre-recorded. They were most of them done on the fly, and I'm still doing them 1 week at a time right now. Okay. I am hoping to grow towards pre-recording, but I now see why it might not have been the best starting point for me when I started, and I'll explain that in a minute. But do I regret it? Do I regret doing the pre-podcast episode? Because apparently it made it so much more difficult. No, like absolutely not. Because I learned so much about all the other stuff that's around it. Usually it's not the thing itself that we're trying to do that's the issue, but it's the other stuff around it. And I was able to learn about the tech, what I was really worried about, kind of in a safe way, and to practice with that. Because I would bring out the pre-podcast series, they would be a little bit less polished. And even though it was kind of the same thing at the end, in my mind, it needed to be less perfect, you know. that mindset gave me the freedom to play around with it a little bit. And probably no one else notices this, because you always notice the flaws in your own stuff much more than other people do. We can talk about that in another episode. But I can clearly see that the first couple of episodes, like the audio was worse, because I would simply forget to click use my microphone. And I would just be recording using the microphone of my laptop. Sort of silly things like that. You kind of have to get into your system. You have to get into a little bit of a rhythm. And by the third or fourth pre-podcast episode, that wasn't an issue anymore. That was just automatic. I also figured out things about my flow. Like, what's the best time for me to record? How much time does it take me to prepare an episode or to edit it? I did very little editing in a pre-podcast series. But I was able to look around in the programs and kind of educate myself on that. And as I'm now editing an episode every week, I'm starting to get faster and faster with that. So no, I definitely don't regret the way that I did it. Would I do it again that way? No. I would so give myself an extra month of time. I mean, also on a personal level, there were a lot of things going on. It was my brother's wedding. I was arranging the wedding cake, which is a big deal because my brother is like an amazing baker. So this cake needed to be spot on. So I was a little bit stressed about that. And we were also going to take like the first big road trip with our son. We were preparing for that and staying for a couple of days. So all that stuff was also happening in the background on top of the normal things that you do for your business and for your family, So I would have given myself an extra month of time because basically I expanded the project. And when you expand a project, let's be honest, you have to expand your timeline too. It's quite unfair to knowingly expect yourself to produce more and keep the quality to where you want it in the same period of time. So that's one thing that I would definitely do differently if I would do it again. And that would have kind of given me a head start to get more of the actual podcast episodes like thought out, at least the topics and things. Would I have pre-recorded more? I think I would have wanted to, yes, but I'm not sure if that would have really given me the results I wanted, because I have a very iterative process. I'm not one of those people who has a super clear idea of what the end result looks like. I have kind of the outline. Podcasts for Introverts. That was the outline, but I don't have all the details when I start. For me, it kind of fills in as I go. And expecting myself to pre-record 10 episodes at that stage when I was just starting, that might have been a little bit unfair, knowing what I know about my natural process. So it's interesting to also learn this about myself, knowing I know this about my process, and still you have this idea of how something should be. Now that I've done a couple of the episodes, it's much more feasible for me to start pre-recording because I've already taken some steps and it's already becoming clearer where I want to take this podcast. So if you enjoyed this little behind the scenes and maybe you want to know a bit more, if you're someone you want to start your own podcast maybe, or if you just want like a detailed case example of how to channel your creativity into a finished product, if you will, in a finite block of time, then join my free masterclass on August 11. I'm going to talk about this in more detail during the masterclass and about what kind of happened during the 6 weeks leading up to the podcast. So this masterclass will go beyond the Share My Process series that you can find on this channel. because I really want to make it a bit practical in a sense. I always try, at least, to include things in my masterclasses that you can take away and learn to leverage in your own process. So I hope that this episode has already given you a few ideas about what you could do in your own process and things to look out for, not just when you're starting a podcast, but basically doing any creative project that you want to do in a defined block of time. Now, 6 weeks isn't a huge amount of time, but it's also not a small amount of time. There's a lot that you can do in 6 weeks. Giving yourself that defined amount to kind of explore a new project is a very effective way to kind of figure things out. And I'm going to share more about that and more things that you could do to help you in that process on the masterclass. So you can read more about the masterclass on the page courses.thefrankermessage.com/masterclasses. I'll also leave the link in the show notes, and you get access to the recording for a month if you want to rewatch, or if you're unable to join us live on August 11. So please sign up if that's interesting for you. Thank you, and let's talk again next week. Thank you for listening to the Productive Introvert Community Podcast. If you're an introverted entrepreneur and you're ready to thrive in your own way, then connect with me on thefrankermessage.com/contact.